Hi, everyone, and welcome to the launch of the Circularity Gap Report for Textiles, or as we call it, CGR Textiles. So before we get started, I would love to know who is in the room with us. So please introduce yourself in the chat by stating your name, organization, role, where you're based, and what you hope to gain from this webinar. And while you do that, I will start with the introductions. So first, I'd like to introduce the team behind this work. So I'm Maya. As project and content lead for CGR Textiles, I will be walking you through the report's main findings. I'll be joined by Andrew, the lead researcher for this work, Hilde, managing director, but also textiles expert, who will be answering questions in the Q&A box. And Shelby, our project manager, who will be helping with any technical issues today, and we hope to have none. And I would also like to highlight that this was a collective effort. So while you only see the four of us today, this project would not have been possible without the Circle Economy team with more than 15 experts across thematic areas, but also an advisory board of over 13 organizations and a number of reviewers, including the H&M Foundation team, who were very central to the robustness of the analysis. So now that you've met the team, I'm going to go over some quick guidelines in today's agenda. So you'll notice that your cameras and microphones are unavailable during the webinar format. So if you have any questions, you can submit them in the Q&A box, and our team will try to answer them directly, or we will address them during the Q&A session planned later. And if you experience any technical issues, please let us know, and we'll try to help you out. So today's agenda is divided into 4 parts. So welcome and introductions, project scope and key findings, ask the experts. So we have a Q&A session planned, and closing and call to action. But before we dive into the report's content, we'll hear a few words from Hilde, representing Circle Economy Foundation, and Christiane from the H&M Foundation, who will set the stage for us. Hilde, I will let you start.
Thank you, Maya, and welcome everyone to our webinar. So amazing to have so many of you here today. My name is Hilde van Duin. I'm the Managing Director of the Circle Economy Foundation. Very briefly about Circle Economy. So Circle Economy is an impact organization. We are not-for-profit. We're based out of Amsterdam, but we're active across the globe. We empower industry, cities, and nations to put the circular economy into action. And we want to ensure that the right data, evidence-based capacities, and funding are available to double global circularity by 2032. We move to the next slide about the Circularity Gap Report. So putting circularity into action starts with understanding the state of play, and the key levers to transition to circularity. Circle Economy in the past years has developed a methodology to measure how circular the world economy is, and to assess the circularity gap of the world, of individual countries and regions. To date, we have delivered 25 circularity gap reports, global across the economy every year, but also CGRs, or circularity gap reports, on national and city level. Our circularity gap reports provide key decision makers from public and private sector with the data they need to design impactful roadmaps. But we also bring other tools to ensure public and private actors are empowered to turn circular ambitions into tangible impact. Next to the Circularity Gap Report, we also provide an online learning platform, the Circularity Academy, and a database of circular case studies and best practices from across the globe, the Knowledge Hub. We'll move to the next slide. Yes, thank you. But Circle Economy also has a long track record working on circular textiles with a dedicated textile program led by our amazing colleague Ola Bakoska. You might know us from one of our recent publications on, for instance, the impacts of textile exports, the employment potential of circular textile strategies, or the Textile Spotlight chapter under the CGR for Ireland that we published recently. But as I said, we are an impact organization, and publishing reports does not guarantee impact. So our textile program, therefore we also piloted the introduction of circular business models with brands under the Switching Gear program. And we launched a circular toolkit to guide other brands in the design and introduction of circular business models. We mapped the recyclability of post-consumer textiles with textile sorters in their facilities throughout Europe and beyond, to inform industry actors, governments, and investors on the potential to redirect these textiles into the value chain. And we deliver train-the-trainer programs with local knowledge partners, for instance, in production countries, to ensure that manufacturers have the knowledge to meet the circular requirements of brands and of the EU. But now over to today. Why are we actually here today? So since the establishment of circular economy in 2012, we have witnessed a growing momentum around circularity. Circularity and circular textiles are the talk of town. But how far along are we in moving from a linear to a circular value chain? To guide meaningful action moving forward, we need to understand where we stand today and identify the key levers to transition to circularity. We need to celebrate the achievements of the industry, for sure, but we also need to be honest about the most pressing challenges to tackle next. So at Circular Economy, we are so grateful for this opportunity to assess the circular state of the textile industry provided to us by H&M Foundation. And therefore, Christiane, maybe over to you for a few words from your side.
Yes, thank you, Maya. Thank you, Hilde, and thank you to the entire Circular Economy team for the massive effort that lies behind all the fantastic insights and details that we will dive into shortly. My name is Christiane Dolva, and I head the work at the H&M Foundation focused on innovation, research, and demonstration projects. And H&M Foundation, shortly, is a philanthropic family-owned organization founded by the Persson family, who's the founders and majority owners of the H&M Group. But we work independently as an organization with an ambition and a goal to provide solutions for the entire industry when it comes to driving it towards a planet positive and inclusive textile industry with a specific focus on supporting the need for a just and fair decarbonization transition. And more than a year ago, we were looking at ourselves and the fact that we often claim that we are addressing gaps and opportunities that in order to drive transformation in the industry. And we asked the question, so then what are the gaps? Knowing that circularity very often is a topic that is talked about and get a lot of attention, but I think also a topic where we felt, looking at the industry, that tends to sometimes be stuck in pilot modes. We were curious to understand the state of circularity today because we felt we needed that in order to understand where the gaps are. On top of that, we felt the need to understand better what are the impacts of different circularity measures and what would be the impact if the industry were to implement and become more circular on a number of different environmental and social indicators. And having a conversation with the circular economy, that coincided well with that team's brilliant ambition of looking at the methodology that they have been using for years now, but applying it to the context of a value chain. So this is a first both for us and for circular economy in terms of applying it to the textile value chain. I am really excited to hear and see the results here, even if I've lived and looked at this report for a long time. However, I'm even more excited to see how this might identify gaps and opportunities that anyone, regardless of if you're a brand, retailer, a manufacturer, a philanthropic organization, an NGO, or an enabler in general, can pick up on and use as a roadmap to make fact-based decisions towards more impactful actions in the future.
Thank you, Christiane. So now that the introductions are complete, we're going to move on to the project background and goals. So the question we try to answer through this report is how circular is the textile sector? So also, so you know, this is the first ever sectoral CGR. It builds on the established methodology of the global CGRs. If you're not familiar with these reports, I would suggest to look them up on the website. One innovative aspect is that this report goes beyond the regular CGR analysis. So we introduce new indicators and methodologies to assess biodiversity and human health, but also 27 pollutants across 8 impact categories, but we'll talk about this more in a moment. We had 4 objectives. So first, quantify the current state of circularity in the global textiles industry. assess the environmental and health impact driven by the industry, and identify and model circular economy strategies to mitigate these impacts. And finally, provide actionable recommendations for industry stakeholders. So first, I want to clarify that when we talk about textiles here, we are referring to the broader TCLF industry. So that's textiles, clothing, leather, and footwear. I also want to highlight that, as you can imagine, particularly if you work in the industry, this report came with challenges. So we had limited global data availability. The value chain is extremely complex, and it links to other sectors, which made data isolation quite difficult. But also is quite broad, and the scope broadness is also difficult in terms of assessing social impacts. So we kind of had to choose our battles. We made a few decisions. So we used a mixed method approach. We combined quantitative and qualitative methods. We also validated the methodology and the results with 3 roundtables with the advisory board. And we also conducted a data isolation exercise to simplify. And we combined certain stages of the value chains together, so the ones that were interconnected. And finally, since we couldn't assess all the social impacts within this project, we prioritized human health and the social implications of environmental impacts. We'll now move on to the next part of the webinar, where we will highlight some of the key findings from this analysis, but just to emphasize on some, you will find all the full analysis in the report and the methodology document. I will hand over now to Andrew, who will present the current state of circularity.
Yes, thank you, Maya, and hi, everyone. So we're going to dive now into the main results of the report. And this section, we will mainly look at 2 things. One is mapping how resources flow through the value chain. And the second is looking at the level of circularity, namely our metric, the circularity metric. So maybe to start with the scope first, we see here that we have 7 stages of the value chain mapped. Our quantitative analysis at this stage, in the baseline stage, mostly focuses on 5 of these. So it omits product design because this is not a material intensive stage. Although in the scenario modeling part, this of course will play an important role and be included. The other part, which is omitted from the baseline case, is consumer use. This is because of the difficulty due to attributing impacts such as energy use and the release of microfibers to activities such as washing, drying, ironing. And finally, post-consumer use is partly included. So the underlying databases are not ideal for assessing the impacts at this stage because they are represented in monetary rather than physical units. Therefore, the impacts of incineration and landfilling should be considered an underestimation at this stage. So now moving into the mapping of the flows, we call this a Sankey diagram. And how to read it is that from the left, you see inputs to the industry. So from material extraction, as well as some recycled inputs. The middle shows the processing steps to make different products. And on the right side is the output. So that's the end of life management. So now to dive into each of these 3 main sections. Starting from the top left, we see the primary inputs, where one of the main things is that 63% of virgin feedstock comes from synthetic oil-based inputs, and the other 37% comes from natural sources, such as cotton. So it's really dominated by synthetic feedstock. Then looking just above that on the diagram, we have inputs from recycled feedstock, both from open loop recycling, so that's coming from industries outside of the textile industry, as well as closed loop recycling. So that's recycling happening within the textile industry. So we can see that the vast majority of recycled feedstock is from open cycling. And that's mainly coming from the plastics industry, namely PET bottles. And then we see a much smaller share, and that's coming from the industry itself. And we can say this is fiber-to-fiber recycling, and this represents a fiber-to-fiber recycling rate of 0.27%. Now moving below that, we see the ancillary inputs used. These include materials needed for energy, such as those to power machinery, to heat production facilities, as well as things like chemicals for agricultural inputs and dyes. So these are primarily based on fossil fuels, and they represent a really huge part of the total material consumption. You see it's even larger than the core input. These inputs are used throughout each stage of the value chain, but due to data limitations, it's difficult to pinpoint exactly the proportions going into each stage. That's why you see the flow faded the way it is here. And finally, looking on the right side, we see the end of life management. So in the same given year, what's happening on the end of life side? Well, we see that 6% of the waste in the year is downcycled into products such as insulation in the building industry, or things like mattress filling, for example. And then a similar quantity, so 8%, is reused either domestically within the same country or exported for resale or further management. And this tends to be in the regions of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Then we have the biggest portion of destination for textile waste, and that's in landfills and incineration. Unfortunately, this is present in countries all around the world. It's a little bit higher in areas where consumers don't have access to textile collection programs. And finally, at the bottom, you see the pre-consumer waste, so waste arising from the processing stages. This represents 22% of waste produced, and the destination of this is largely unknown at a global level, but data exists in smaller pockets. So this represents another large data gap we discovered in this analysis. Now, finally, moving on to the other part, and that's the circularity metric. So firstly, what is the circularity metric? Well, we define it as the share of secondary material consumption over the total material consumption. The total material consumption not only considers the physical weight of products consumed, but converts these back into what is known as raw material equivalents. So this represents the total raw materials extracted that are ultimately directed towards the industry. This shows a much more complete picture of the impact that the industry is driving in terms of material extraction, as opposed to only the physical weight of products consumed. So think of dyes, for example, really tracing that back into the raw materials needed to produce dyes. So as you will have already seen on the screen, our analysis yielded a circularity metric of 0.3%. So you really see the small proportion of secondary materials consumed over the total material consumption. This metric is significantly lower than what we calculated for the global economy in the latest year, which was 7.2%. So we really see how far behind the textile value chain is in utilizing secondary materials compared to the huge levels of production that's occurring. Now I will pass it back to Maya, who's going to go delve deeper into the current environmental and health impacts of the industry.
Thanks, Andrew. So as we mentioned earlier, this report, we evaluated the industry's contribution to 8 critical environmental and health impacts, ranging from material footprint to human health. Why we chose these categories is because they reflect how far-reaching and interconnected the industry is. So I'm going to highlight a few examples where we're going to dive more into this in a moment. So for example, our results show that the industry contributes between 2.2% on air pollution and 5.3% on marine and freshwater eutrophication. Also, over 3% of the global material footprint can be attributed to textiles. We also dive deeper into regional differences. So our results show that the US and China contribute to the largest share of all categories. But you can find more information about the impact of the industry in the US and China in the appendix section of the report. So unfortunately, during 1 hour, we did not have the time to dive deeper into that part of the report. So now, to unpack these categories, one interesting result is that the textiles industry has the highest impact on marine and freshwater eutrophication among all environmental categories. So this accounts for 27% for marine eutrophication and 31% for freshwater eutrophication. This is mainly driven by production, manufacturing, and waste management activities. Key drivers for this include the use of fertilizers and pesticides in crop cultivation and tanning processes, which in turn can harm aquatic ecosystems and biodiversity. So it's all kind of connected. Water scarcity is also a major concern for the textiles industry. So it accounts for 21%, with the industry consuming 93 billion cubic meters annually. Cotton cultivation and dyeing processes are particularly water intensive, but that also places significant pressure on already water-stressed regions like Bangladesh. Climate change accounts for over 3% of global emissions, and the sector drives 13% of greenhouse gas emissions in production activities. So this is mainly due to wet processing, which is 55% of all of these emissions. The industry contributes 14% of terrestrial and freshwater acidification. This is mainly due to production and agriculture, which is driven by sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxide emissions. And finally, 17% of biodiversity loss is caused by the industry's soil degradation, deforestation, and ocean acidification. And synthetic textiles contribute 16 to 35% of marine microplastics. So as we know, marine microplastics can endanger marine ecosystems, but also coastal communities who are using these ecosystem services. So basically fisheries and other activities. The textiles industry contributes 2% of global health impacts. 7% of this is linked to production due to toxic chemicals and poor working conditions. It also accounts for 7% of air pollution driven by VOCs and particulates from manufacturing and transportation. All of these affect mostly vulnerable groups, so particularly women and children. But this is not all. So we also want to emphasize that beyond environmental and health impacts, the industry faces many social challenges that can affect the transition towards a socially just circular economy. So the circular economy is not just by default. And in terms of employment impact, the industry faces issues like excessive working hours, wage inequalities, and widespread informality, which is mainly found in Bangladesh and India, where over 90% of textile workers are informal, mainly being women who already face lower wages and limited opportunities for advancement. We're going to look at this a bit more in detail later, but now I'm going to hand over to Andrew. So all of these challenges highlight the urgent need for systemic change, and Andrew will walk us through 6 scenarios to bridge the circularity gap.
Yes, thanks again, Maya. So yes, I'm going to go through the 6 circular scenarios, looking at the impact that they had, both on the different environmental impacts that Maya just walked through, as well as the circularity metric. So what's important to note is that these are exploratory what-if scenarios. So exploring different things to see, okay, where are the biggest levers in the industry and where should the attention be focused. So starting with our first scenario, on the next slide, we focused on material choice. Here we modeled an increase in natural, locally sourced fibers. So as well as increasing the share of recycled portion. The second scenario was similar, but exploring the opposite trend of increasing the materials consumed that come from synthetics in order to be able to compare them. But also for this scenario, we also modeled if textiles can be used for longer, so longer lasting, more durable textiles. How can this affect the overall consumption? And additionally, we also modeled the increase in recycled portion. The third scenario, we focused on natural fibers again, and here we looked at increased resource efficiency from exploring different agricultural practices. So looking at things like regenerative and organic agricultural practices in order to decrease inputs such as water, chemicals, as well as decreasing outputs such as greenhouse gas emissions and water pollution. The fourth scenario takes a look at what we call the slow fashion movement from both a supply and demand perspective. So here we modeled a reduction in share of unsold products, given that it's been reported that around 30% of garments produced annually go unsold. And we also look at the demand side. So what can consumers do in order to prolong the lifespan of their own garments? So looking at things like repair initiatives and resale initiatives amongst consumers. The fifth scenario focuses on manufacturing, where both material and environmental efficiency are modeled. So both decreasing material input as well as reducing environmental impacts, such as greenhouse gas emissions and air pollution through the use of cleaner and more innovative advanced technologies. The final scenario explores the industry's trade dynamics. So what we did here is that we modeled a shift in production from the Asia-Pacific region to the US and Europe to explore what impact that would have if where textiles are produced in the world has some level of shift. So moving on to the results that we found from each of these scenarios. The first scenario showed a negative result, where a shift to more natural fibers actually increased most environmental impacts, except for material footprint and greenhouse gas emissions. So this really highlights the trade-offs when it comes to material choice, that it's not just so simple as one is better than the other. There are lots of things to consider. The second scenario showed a more positive result, but that's really owed to the fact that we modeled more durable, longer lasting textile products, in this case in the form of synthetics. So we saw a reduction across all environmental impacts, as well as the largest increase in circularity metric. So this really emphasizes the need that, or the point that absolute reduction in consumption of new textiles is a really large lever to become more circular and more sustainable. The third scenario had limited impact. This was due to the smaller market share of natural fibers, as well as the trade-offs in the practices that I mentioned. So for example, organic farming uses less fossil fuel-based inputs for fertilizers, for example, but generally produces lower yields of crops. So we didn't see a shift in circularity metric here. Okay, moving on to the fourth scenario. This had a modestly positive result across all impact categories, again, highlighting the effectiveness of decreasing production and consumption, because that's essentially what it aimed to do on both the supply and the demand, the consumer side. Likewise, the fifth scenario also yielded a positive result. This is because there was a decreased consumption of virgin fibers, and ancillary inputs such as fossil fuels and water. So this would include things such as having more renewable energy within production facilities. Finally, the scenario that looked at shifting trade dynamics also had a positive impact across all categories. So although this was partly to do with reducing transport-related impacts to industry, since a lot of textiles are produced in Asia and consumed in places like North America and Europe. But what was even more important was that the resource efficiency in the US and Europe was better. So this may be owed to stricter environmental regulations, but this is one of the reasons that the shift would require less materials in general, according to our analysis. So bringing all of these individual results together, we found that when combining them all, environmental impacts were reduced by up to 50%. So between 35 and 50% actually, of all categories. So that's a really huge result. We saw that marine eutrophication had the biggest impact reduction with minus 50%. And in turn, this increased the circularity metric by threefold, from 0.3% to 0.9%. So what does this tell us about circularity? Well, what's really important to always remember is that circularity should be seen as a tool and not a goal. So in this case, it's a tool that has been shown to have really positive environmental impacts, which is the goal. So we should be focusing more on that than just looking at 0.9 and thinking that's bad, because actually that had quite positive results. It's a very low starting point limits the potential. So starting from 0.3% means that although we made a lot of changes in the scenario modeling, tripling it still yields what could be considered a low percent. Finally, we see that recycling efforts are far outweighed by the current high levels of production and consumption. You see the numbers at the bottom of those equations are far higher, and so there's far more leverage there for change in order to increase the metric, thus decrease environmental impacts. And it's important, so that's the biggest lever, but of course both sides of the coin are important. The recycling secondary materials part and the total consumption. If we were to only focus on recycling, we could create theoretically a 100% circular system, but if this still had significant environmental impacts, then that would kind of defeat the purpose. So I'm going to leave it here in terms of our high-level findings so that we have some time to take questions before Maya will conclude.
Thanks, Andrew. So let's move on to the Q&A session and address some of the questions. So I was told by the team that we have a few questions that were unanswered. So first question, or maybe Hilde, do you want to come in and share them with us? Maybe that would be
Of course,
easier.
Maya. And maybe in case you haven't realized, I mean, in this Circle Economy Q&A control room, we are working extremely hard because there are a lot of questions coming in. So temperatures are heating up here. But one question I would like to start with, which is a question I think that we also get a lot, is what circularity metric rate would be considered good? Because of course we say 0.3% now for the textiles industry, but what is the circularity metric rate that would be considered good? Is 100% circular as a metric, is that a good thing or not?
I can maybe start with this one, Hilde. So as we saw, a shift from 0.3 to 0.9% was able to decrease environmental impacts by 35 to 50%. And I think it's more tangible to think about this. So when we think about what's good or not, these days it tends to be easier to think of reaching net zero or decreasing greenhouse gas emissions by 50%. And we say, okay, that's good, or decreasing greenhouse gas emissions by 90%. So I think it's about relating it to that. And so we see a circularity metric of 0.9 has this outcome. So then a circularity metric of 3 would have an even bigger impact than minus 50%, which I would consider good. So it's just important, this link between the outcome and the metric as a tool. So I can't give you a concrete answer, but I hope that helps in some way.
Yeah, and I want to add to that the circularity metric is more of an exploratory tool rather than giving, an exact number. We're just giving an idea of what can happen also in different scenarios. And as we saw, the biggest impacts were on environmental and human health impacts. So this is where the metric, the higher we get in the metric, the less we have impact. But also, we also saw that if we don't reduce the production levels, all of this doesn't really make sense either. So we have to keep this in mind also in terms of the systemic change that we need. I see another question on pollution that was addressed at me. I can answer it. So the question is, hi Maya, the air pollution by textiles is 2.2%. Does this include the end of life emissions too? Landfilling, incineration, downcycling included. So yes, this includes everything, but we did see that most of the air pollution was made during production processes and manufacturing. So I hope this answers this question. Next one is the clothing exported or donated globally often ends up in landfills, as we see in African countries like Ghana. So in a way, textiles waste from developed countries end up as trash in developing countries. We also see this in the recent documentary Buy It Now. Any data on that? So we did include that into the report. So I invite you to read the full report to have this information. However, this was just one section of the report. So don't expect a full chapter on it, but we do mention the waste that is being taken from the global north into the global south, and we do explain where it goes in particular. So Ghana is included also there. Any more questions that we missed?
From my end, maybe, and also trying to combine a few questions into one. There were quite some questions on the scenarios. And I think they maybe also hint a bit at disappointment on the effect of these scenarios. So could you please elaborate on why do the circular scenarios only increase the circularity metric to 0.9%?
Yes, good question. So again, I think it comes back to my point that the starting point really limits the potential. So if you think of the equation, if the scenarios can decrease material consumption by 2/3, which is a lot for us to all consume 66% less, the whole industry, this would triple the metric. But because the starting point is low, tripling the metric then yields 0.9 theoretically. So it's really about that starting point, and that the industry is so lagging that it really requires huge systemic changes in production and consumption patterns in order to start reaching circularity levels well beyond this.
Any more pressing questions?
So many questions. Really, I mean, I think we have 31 open questions. I don't know so much more time you have, Maya and Andrew, but maybe a very specific one also related to one of the scenarios. So, for instance, does the scenario of relocating production from Asia Pacific to the EU and the USA also to consider the impact on pricing of textile products and therefore on consumption?
Yes, It doesn't, in short. So these were one of our limitations. And there are always, it's always a matter of how many assumptions are possible, and a factor like this and some of the rebound effects, of course, also important. These were also not possible to incorporate. So that's definitely, was one of the limitations with this.
Yeah, we must also emphasize that within a 1-year project, this was, we had a specific scope that we could assess within. So we really had to kind of choose our battles of where do we want to focus our attention. So we did look at the US and China, but we looked more at what is the industry's impact within the US and China rather than really how it relates to other parts of the value chain.
Okay, I also see some questions. Maybe I can pick one here also. So somebody asks, thank you. It sounds like the circularity metric is weight-based. Yes, that's correct. Does this metric result in disparity in comparison to other materials, for example, steel versus cotton? Yes, so this is an important point. But I think what's important here is that within the textiles industry, we are comparing the same materials, so cotton versus cotton. Or if there is an analysis done for the steel sector or building industry, it's comparing building products versus building products. So they kind of cancel each other out, the weight aspect. That's in short.
Perfect. More questions on scenarios. We still have time. A short one and then a longer one. What is the time horizon on these scenarios? Could you clarify?
Yes, so these are what we call what-if scenarios. So we don't have a time horizon. It's basically saying, if we do this, what is the impact? And in our scenario modeling, we didn't go into that detail here, but we modeled different levels of ambition, basically, so sensitivity analysis. This helps us to have a better oversight of these what-ifs, depending on what happens in the coming years.
More on scenarios. Did you take into consideration in scenario 2 the microplastics from synthetic materials?
Yes and no. So we did mention in the impacts section of the report microplastics and its effects on the environment. But however, in the scenario particularly, it was very difficult to quantify. So it's really, we had as we said earlier, we had a lot of data challenges for that report.
Yeah. And in relation to data challenges, how far back in the value chain have you gone for your metrics? Have you gone all the way back to cotton agriculture and creation of polyester monomaterials?
Yeah, so we went really from crop cultivation all the way to waste management. So we looked at all the different stages of the value chain. We did have to simplify some of the value chains because we had a lot of double counting. So we did need to make sure that we weren't double counting. So we did, for example, put production processes under manufacturing altogether and agriculture within that as well.
Another one on scenarios. If both positive effects on the circularity metric of embracing slow fashion and more durable garment scenarios are due to reducing overall consumption and production, why is the metric so different, 0.3 versus 0.8? So it's about the scenarios embracing slow fashion and more durable garments.
Yes, so yeah, this really comes down to the assumptions behind them. And so the durable garment one likely had larger assumptions behind it. And in our methodology document, we list the assumptions and where we based that from. So trying to find different sources of literature to provide these ranges. So I can't give you a direct answer right now, but these are the sort of things we lay out step by step. But maybe just to add to that, then, yeah, we apply these interventions to certain parts of the market. So it's really depends. Yeah, depends on the assumption.
Yeah, we would like to really invite you to look at the methodology document as well, because there you will find all of the data sources, all of the methodologies that we use and how we calculated everything.
Yeah. And then maybe a question just based on our experience working in other sectors, of course, when we do more generic circularity gap reports. So if you compare textiles to industries that have a higher scores on circularity, what would be your advice for the first steps in textiles to become better? Or what was maybe your reflection on the specifics of circularity in the textile industry versus what we normally find when we look at global economies, for instance?
Well, I think two things from my side is that one of the challenges was the data availability. So we do see that this is an industry that is so complex and globalized that it's very difficult to isolate data, particularly when no one is really monitoring or calculating what's going on. So this is one. And two, we do think that also this industry englobes so many different types of products, right? So we were looking at the TCLF sector in general, that's clothing, that's leather, that's footwear, that's so many different products that if you work in the industry, you understand that they're particularly complex themselves as well. So that makes it a more difficult value chain. So I guess for the first CGR that is sectoral, this was definitely not the easiest one that we could have chosen. So I would imagine that in other sectors that are more monitored by, for example, governmental organizations, let's say aluminum or plastic, which is, I think, a little bit more followed or where data is a bit more available, it might have been easier. So this was not the easiest task, let's say.
That's like what we like to do at Circular Economy, right? Start with the most complex things. Anything to add, Andrew?
No, I totally agree with Maya there, that in general, sort of consumer goods are more complex. So I think this emphasizes the importance of the design stage for this. So we see so many different types of textiles. Also in the collection at the end, it's distributed at consumers. When we compare this to the building sector, for example, this is a bit more of a centralized process with more homogeneous materials such as steel and concrete. So it's a bit easier to manage, let's say. So, yeah.
And maybe if I still have a few minutes to add more questions, to fire more questions at you. But question on the PET bottles. So this 0.3%, does it include the recycling of PET bottles? And also, does it include the recycling of PET bottles? And do we then consider that a very circular practice?
Yeah, I can take this one. So yes, it includes PET bottles, so open loop recycling. Is this very circular? It's definitely lower on the hierarchy of circularity. So yeah, there's, I guess, different levels. It's not just black or white, and so we would consider this lower, but we decided to include it in the circularity metric calculation because this represents the largest share, and there would be almost negligible level of circularity if we only considered fiber to fiber.
So this is a good transition to the next part, because we do think that the most circular would be to reduce production, actually. So let's go to the closing and call to action. So since this is the end of the webinar, the question that we really have now is, so what do we do now? So how can we turn all of these results into action? And first, I'd like to invite you to scan the QR code to access the report land page. So there you can explore examples of circular textiles initiatives, but also we created some gamified learning tracks that you can try. And second, we can have a look now at the steps we can take to close the circularity gap. So we have identified 4 priority areas for immediate action. So I'll highlight some examples here, but you will find more details in the reports with also more examples of how to do that. So first, and this is what we've been mentioning a couple of times during the session, is that we should transform the industry by reducing production volume. So we established earlier that this is crucial to increase circularity. So brands, retailers, solution providers, consumers, governments, and the third sectors can do that, for example, by extending product lifespan and increasing fiber-to-fiber recycling. Second, we should set environmental priorities that go beyond carbon reduction. So as we saw earlier, marine eutrophication scored the highest in terms of environmental impacts. So governments, brands, retailers, research institutions, and the third sector should focus on water management, pollution prevention, cleaner production processes, and set global standards. Third, we should ensure a socially just circular transition. So the circular economy by itself is not just. Governments, brands, manufacturers, workers' unions, and the third sector must support workers to gain the skills necessary for circular activities. And you have more details about what these circular activities are in the report. They must work together also to close the gender gap and include informal workers in the conversation. We saw that informal workers were making up most of the workers in the textiles industry today. And finally, we should coordinate across science, policy, and finance. Governments, financial institutions, technology innovators, research institutions, brands, and solution providers should globalize and normalize circularity indicators. But we should also improve data collection and monitoring and facilitate green financing. So there's a lot of innovations out there that are not scalable at the moment that need financing. And to reach the end of the webinar, we are hoping that this report is just the beginning. So as we said, this is our first sectoral CGR. We will send you a follow-up email where you'll find a link to the report's landing page, a subscription link for updates, and a quick survey to share your feedback. But also, if your organization, city, or country is interested in assessing how circular its textiles value chain is, please reach out to us. And yeah, we've reached the end of this webinar, and thank you everyone for joining us today, and let's stay connected. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.